Have you ever had your heart broken so bad you thought you might not recover? Well, Silas Brennan did. Then, 3 years later, the woman who did it appeared in a blizzard, wearing a wedding dress and nearly frozen to death. If you want to know why this runaway bride ran barefoot through a storm to find him, you better stick around. Go on and drop a comment telling me what town you are watching from. I am curious to see how far this story goes. Silas was just trying to get his two little boys, Eli and Sam, home through a nasty Montana storm. The wind was howling something fierce. His 5-year-old Sam whimpered about being cold, huddled between his daddy and big brother. Silas just stared down the road, saying they were almost home, but he knew it was a lie. The blizzard was only getting worse with every step the tired horses took. It was a bad spot to be in, and he knew it. All of a sudden, his older boy Eli grabbed his arm. "Papa, look!" Through the swirling snow, Silas saw a strange shape. It was not a deer. It was a woman standing stock still in the middle of the road like some kind of ghost. He pulled the horses to a halt and climbed down. The woman wore a fine wedding dress, now torn and dirty, but her feet, good Lord, her feet were bare, bleeding and turning blue on the frozen ground. He moved closer and called out to her. When she finally lifted her head, Silas felt the air leave his lungs. It was Clara, the woman he was supposed to marry 3 long years ago, the one who had vanished without a word, leaving his world in shambles. He whispered her name, a sound stolen by the wind, and she collapsed. He lunged forward and caught her just before she hit the ice. She felt as light as a bundle of twigs. "Is that lady dead, Papa?" his little boy cried from the wagon. "Not yet," Silas yelled back, his own voice shaking something awful. He gently carried Clara to the wagon and covered her with his own thick coat. He did not know how to answer when Eli asked who she was. He just snapped the reins, his mind racing. He had to save the one woman he had spent so long trying to hate. His ranch house was a godsend through the storm. Silas ordered the boys inside to get a fire roaring while he carried Clara in from the biting cold. He laid her on the sofa. Her breathing was so shallow you could barely see her chest move. Her skin was a terrible shade of gray, and her poor feet were already turning black from the frostbite. "She is not going to die," Silas muttered, his jaw set like stone. He worked on her for what felt like an eternity, slowly rubbing life back into her frozen hands. At last, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were wild with fear until they landed on his face. "Silas," she breathed, her voice a dry crackle. "I found you." Tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "I had to find you," she whispered, gripping his hand tight. "I had to before it was too late." "Too late for what?" he asked her, leaning in close. But she was already gone, passed out again from the strain. Silas sat back, the weight of it all settling on him. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside his quiet cabin, with the woman who had wrecked his past lying on his sofa, Silas knew a whole different kind of storm had just begun, and he was standing right in the middle of it. 3 years. That is how long it had been since Clara's father met him at the door with a look colder than a winter wind. Silas stood on that porch, wildflowers dying in his hand and a ring burning a hole in his pocket. The old man had just sneered and said, "She is gone." She changed her mind. No note, no explanation, nothing but a cruel laugh before the door slammed shut in his face. The whole town had their stories, but Silas learned to ignore them. He worked his land, raised his boys, and tried his best to bury the memory of a ghost. He told himself it was time to move on. And now, after all that time, she was here, asleep on his sofa, wearing a wedding dress that was never meant for him. "Why now, Clara?" he whispered to her sleeping form. Just after midnight, she finally stirred. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Sil." He sat up straight, his heart pounding. Clara was watching him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She looked so small and fragile under the blankets. "You are awake," he said, because he could not think of anything else. Her eyes drifted around the simple cabin. "This is your home," she stated softly. "It is good. It feels safe." "It is not much," he replied. "It is everything," she said, her voice cracking. "Where in the world have you been, Clara?" he finally asked, his voice tight. 3 whole years without a single word. I thought you were dead." "I wrote to you by acting," she shot back, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "What?" he stammered. "I wrote to you," she repeated, pushing herself up on one elbow. 3 letters in the first year. I told you everything. I told you I had not chosen to leave. I never got any letters. I know that now, she said, her voice shaking with anger and grief. But back then, I thought you had. I thought you read my words and decided I was not worth the trouble. I thought my family was right about you. Your family? Silas asked, confused. They took me, Silas. My father and 2 of his men. They came to my room the night before our wedding. They put me in a wagon and drove me all the way to Denver, she continued. They gave me to a man named Marcus Holloway. The name sounded like poison coming from her lips. He was a wealthy mining baron, 52 years old. My father owed him a lot of money, she explained. The deal was simple. Holloway would forgive the debt, and in return, he would get a young wife. Silas felt the floor drop out from under him. Your father sold you, he said slowly, like you were livestock. A bitter laugh escaped her. He told me I should be grateful, that Holloway could give me a better life than a simple rancher ever could. I would have given you everything, Silas said through gritted teeth. I know, she whispered, tears finally falling. I told them that, but my father said the deal was done. He said if I loved my family, I would do my duty. Silas shot up from his chair, pacing the floor like a caged animal. 3 years, he growled, his hands shaking with rage. They held you prisoner for 3 years. It did not start that way, she said. At first they called it preparation. I had lessons on etiquette and dancing. They said the wedding would happen once I was properly trained. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. But the wedding was always delayed. Holloway was always traveling for business. I think he just wanted the idea of a wife, something beautiful he could own and show off at parties. Tonight, they finally set the date. They dressed me up and told me to smile. But you ran, Silas finished for her. I climbed out a window, she said, her chin lifting with defiance. I tore this ridiculous dress and ran barefoot into the snow. I knew if I stayed there one more minute, I would die anyway. Maybe not my body, but my soul for sure. Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling fire. Silas slowly crossed the room and knelt by her side. He could see the exhaustion etched on her face. The letters, he asked gently. Who did you give them to? Her face crumpled. Your foreman, Jed Carver. I saw him in Denver. I slipped the letters to him, and he promised. He swore he would deliver them to you himself. Jed Carver. The name landed like a bullet in the quiet cabin. Silas rocked back on his heels. Jed. The man who had offered him sympathy and whiskey when Clara disappeared. The man who had watched him grieve day after day, knowing the truth the entire time. He destroyed them, Silas said, the realization hitting him with cold certainty. He took your letters and let me believe you had abandoned me. I am so sorry, she cried, her hand finding his. I did not know. I thought you had given up on me. They looked at each other, seeing the 3 years of lies and pain that had been forced between them. I never stopped loving you, Clara, she whispered. Even when I tried to hate you, I could not. Silas could not speak. He just lifted her cold hand to his lips and kissed it. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Rest now, he told her. Silas, she said, her grip tightening on his hand. Holloway will come looking for me. My father, too. They will not let me go easily. Let them come, he said, his voice low and steady. This is my land. Their money and power mean nothing out here. She searched his face for any sign of fear but found only determination. You would risk all of this for me? After I disappeared and left you with nothing but questions? Silas stood and looked down at the woman who had walked through a blizzard to find her way back to him. You did not disappear, he said firmly. You were taken. There is a difference. He walked toward the door, then paused. Tomorrow day, he said, his voice hard as steel, we are going to have a talk with Jed Carver. The name hung in the air, not as a question, but as a promise. Clara woke up on a sofa, the sting in her feet a sharp reminder of the blizzard she'd barely survived. 2 little boys were standing there, just staring. The older one, Eli, had his father's serious eyes. The younger Sam was chewing on a worn-out blanket. Papa said you might die, Eli stated, not unkindly. You didn't. Clara almost smiled. The boy was direct, just like his father, Silas. What's your name? She asked softly. I'm Eli. This is Sam. He don't talk to strangers. Just then, Silas walked in, his arms full of firewood. Boys, let her rest, he said, his voice a low rumble. I'm fine, Clara insisted, trying to sit up. The pain in her feet told a different story. Your feet say otherwise, Silas noted, a ghost of a smile on his face. Stubborn as ever. It saved my life last night, she shot back. He couldn't argue with that. Stubbornness was what got her through miles of frozen wasteland. That, and a hope she hadn't dared to name. Papa? Eli asked, pulling on his father's coat. Is she staying? Silas looked at Clara, a whole world of questions hanging in the air between them. For now, he said at last. She's staying for now. Sam pulled his thumb from his mouth and gave her a grin. 'Cause I like her hair. In that moment, the little boy's simple kindness meant more to Clara than all the fancy words she'd heard in 3 long years. You knew our papa before, didn't you? Eli asked, his gaze steady. I did, Clara admitted. Were you his sweetheart? Before Silas could stop him, Clara answered. Yes, a long, long time ago. Then why'd you leave? The question was like a punch to the gut. How could she explain the evil in the world to a 7-year-old? She didn't leave, Silas said quietly, his eyes dark with memory. She was taken. There's a difference. Taken by who? Eli pressed. Bad people? Worse, Silas said. The kind of people who smile while they're hurting you. Later, when the boys were outside, Clara knew she had to tell him the rest. Silas, we need to talk about Jed. His jaw went tight. I know. She took a deep breath. The first letter I wrote was 2 weeks after they took me. I told you everything, that my father had forced me into an engagement with a man named Holloway. I begged you to come get me. I would have, he said, his voice thick with pain. I know, that's why I wrote it, she said, her hands twisting in the blanket. When you didn't answer, I wrote again a month later, then a third time, 6 months in. I drew you a map, Silas. I told you about the guards, the unlocked windows. I gave you everything you needed. And Jed took all 3 letters, Silas finished for her, his face like stone. I handed them right to him, Clara whispered. He looked me in the eye and swore on his mother's grave he'd give them to you. A bitter laugh escaped her. He wanted you, Silas said, understanding and a terrible rage dawning in his eyes. He figured if I was gone, if you thought I'd run off, maybe he'd have a chance. I trusted him, Silas said, the words torn from his throat. For 6 years, he ate at my table. He helped raise my boys. He was like family. Silas didn't say another word. He grabbed his coat and stormed out toward the bunkhouse, his heart pounding with 6 years of lies. He threw the door open to find Jed Carver sipping coffee. Found someone in the storm last night, Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. Clara Whitmore. A flicker of fear in Jed's eyes was all the confession Silas needed. She told me she wrote to me, Silas said, taking a step forward. 3 times. Jed's face went pale. He knew he was caught. He knew what was coming. The next time trouble came, it rode in on horseback. A man named Burke, one of Holloway's men, was telling Clara she had to come with them. But this time, she wasn't alone. Silas stood beside her, unmoving. This ain't over, Burke snarled, looking from Silas to Clara and then to the 7-year-old boy standing on the porch. Little Eli was holding a shotgun, his face set with a calm that chilled Burke to the bone. You tell Holloway to come himself next time, Silas said evenly. Burke and his men didn't need to be told twice. They wheeled their horses around and rode off fast. She ain't confused, Jed, Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. She remembers just fine. She handed you 3 letters herself. You swore on your mother's grave you never saw them. That was 3 chances to tell me the truth. 3 chances to do the right thing. And you destroyed every one. Jed's confident look finally shattered. You don't know what you are talking about. Then explain it. In a flash, Silas had Jed by the collar, slamming him hard against the wall. Do not lie to me. Not now. You owe me the truth. Jed's hands flew up, grabbing at Silas's wrists, but it was no use. All right, he choked out. All right, damn you, I took them. Silas's grip got even tighter. Wait, because you were better off without her, Jed spat, the ugly confession hanging in the air. Better off? Silas repeated, the words tasting like poison. A woman like that, all educated and refined? She would have ruined you, Silas. She would have grown to hate the life you gave her. She would have left you eventually. That was not your decision to make. Someone had to make it. You were too blind in love to see it. Silas stared at the man he had trusted for 6 long years, the friend who had poured him whiskey while he grieved. You watched me fall apart, Silas said quietly. You watched me wonder why she left, and you said nothing. I was protecting you. No, Silas said. You were protecting yourself. I know you loved her too, but she chose me. You have this ranch now. You have those boys. Those boys do not have a mother because I stopped looking for love after I thought Clara left me. The words tore from Silas's throat. I married Sarah because she was kind and practical, but I could never give her my whole heart. You stole the piece that belonged to Clara. Sarah deserved better than a broken man. The silence in the room was deafening. Silas finally released Jed, his own hand shaking. Get out, he ordered. What? You are done here. Pack your things and get off my land. Silas, you cannot. I can. You have until noon. After that, if I see your face again, I will not be responsible for what happens. That is not my concern anymore, Silas said. You are making a big mistake. That woman's fiancé, Holloway, has money and power. He will burn this place to the ground. Silas paused in the doorway and looked back at the man who had betrayed him. Maybe he will try, he said, but I would rather die fighting for what is right than live knowing I never fought at all. He walked out into the cold. Clara was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. I heard shouting, she said, her eyes full of worry. It is done, Silas told her, climbing the steps. He admitted everything. He took your letters and let us both suffer all these years. Tears filled Clara's eyes. I am so sorry. Jed's choices are his own, not yours, Silas said, his voice softening. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You survived. You escaped. You walked through a blizzard to find me. Never apologize for that. She covered his hand with hers. What happens now? Now we wait, Silas said. Jed will be gone by noon, and after that, Holloway will come. He will not stop, Clara whispered. He is not the kind of man who accepts losing. Neither am I, Silas declared. Just then, their son's voice called from the barn. Papa, come quick! Silas was already moving. In the barn, his boy Eli stood pointing toward the road. Riders, Eli said. 4 of them, coming fast. Get inside, Silas told the boys. Take Clara with you and lock the doors. But Clara did not move. You too, Silas told her. I am not hiding, she stated firmly. I will not let you face them alone. There was no time to argue. The riders were close now. The man in the lead was Thomas Burke, Holloway's head of security. Miss Whitmore, Burke called out as they stopped. Mr. Holloway has been worried sick. We are here to take you back. I am not going back, Clara's voice rang out, clear and steady. Burke's eyes scanned Silas. Get off my land, Silas said, his voice flat. Now there is no need for that, Burke said with a cold smile. We are just here to escort the lady home. My mind is fine, Clara snapped. I would rather freeze to death than marry that man. Let us not make this difficult, Miss Whitmore. Burke's tone hardened. It is already difficult, Silas said, stepping between Clara and the riders. The lady said she is not going. That is the end of it. I am afraid it is not. She has a legal agreement with Mr. Holloway. An agreement she was forced into. The law does not require her consent, Burke said. Now we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, she is coming with us. The 3 men behind him spread out, their hands drifting toward their pistols. You are 1 man against 4, Burke said, his eyes glinting. You have children in that cabin. Think about what happens to them if this goes badly. The threat hit its mark. Silas's jaw tightened. I will go, Clara whispered, her heart breaking. No, Silas said through gritted teeth. Last chance, Brennan, Burke warned. Step aside. Silas's hand found the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Get off my land, he repeated slowly. I will not ask again. The standoff was silent and deadly. Then a voice rang out from the barn. Papa is not alone. Everyone turned. Eli stood in the doorway, his father's old shotgun held steady at his shoulder. I know how to shoot, the boy said, his voice clear. Papa taught me. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Silas knelt in front of his son and gently took the heavy shotgun. "That was brave, son," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And foolish. You needed help," Eli said simply. Silas pulled the boy into a fierce hug. From the porch, Clara watched them, tears finally falling freely. These people, this man and his two brave boys, had stood between her and the wolves. They had become her family. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to face it. She was finally home. A gust of wind made him clutch his rifle tighter. For 3 nights, Silas hadn't truly slept, keeping watch over his boys by the fire. Clara was getting better, but her frostbitten feet were still bandaged. She refused to be helpless, though. On the 3rd morning, she pushed a plate of food at him. "You need to eat something, Silas." He just shook his head, staring out the window. "Not hungry." "Starving yourself won't make that man go away," she said, her voice firm. He finally looked at her, his eyes shadowed and weary. "I am not starving myself. I am trying to figure out how to keep you alive when a man with endless money and no soul comes to collect what he thinks is his." The weight of her trouble felt heavy in the small cabin. "Maybe I should just leave," she whispered. "No," Silas cut her off. "You would not make it 50 miles. He has men everywhere. So we just wait for him to burn us out?" Before he could answer, his boy Eli crashed through the door, out of breath. "Papa, someone's coming. A whole bunch of them." Silas was on his feet, rifle in hand. "How many?" "I counted 12 riders, Papa, and a real fancy carriage." 12 men. Clara's face went pale. "He came himself. Holloway is here." "Get the boys in the root cellar, now," Silas ordered. When his son hesitated, wanting to fight, Silas softened his voice. "I need you to protect your brother. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded bravely and followed his mother. At the cellar door, Clara looked back. "Do not die for me, Silas," he met her gaze. "I'm not planning on it. But some things are worth fighting for." With the cellar door shut, Silas stepped onto the porch. Holloway's men spread out, surrounding his home. A black carriage rolled to a stop, and a thin man in an expensive coat stepped out. Marcus Holloway was smaller than Silas expected, with a slick smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Brennan," his voice carried, smooth as honey, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "There is nothing here that belongs to you," Silas said flatly. Now, Holloway said, walking toward the porch. "Clara Whitmore is my fiancée. I have simply come to take her home." "She does not want to go home. What a woman wants is often irrelevant," Holloway sneered. "They are emotional creatures who need men to guide them." Silas's hand tightened on his rifle. "She is not your wife yet." "A small detail," Holloway said, his smile widening. "She ran off in a blizzard, you see. Clearly, her mind is disturbed." He climbed the porch steps, his eyes as cold and empty as a snake's. "I am prepared to be generous, Mr. Brennan. Give me Clara, and I will give you a fresh start. $10,000, enough to buy a spread twice this size. More money than Silas had ever dreamed of. She is not for sale." Holloway's smile finally flickered. "Everything is for sale." "Get off my land." The smile vanished completely. "Very well," Holloway said, turning to his men. "Search the property. Find her." As the riders dismounted, Silas raised his rifle. The shot kicked up dirt right at the feet of the closest man, freezing everyone in place. "The next one goes in someone's chest," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "And I am not particular about whose." "You are 1 man against 12, Holloway scoffed. "I will take at least 4 of you with me," Silas countered. "Are you willing to bet you are not one of them?" Just then a shout came from the road. "Riders coming, lots of them." Hoofbeats thundered closer, and a moment later a posse of local men appeared, led by Sheriff Jim Cartwright. "What in tarnation is going on here?" the sheriff demanded. Holloway's composure returned instantly. "Sheriff, perfect timing. I am here to retrieve my fiancée, whom this man is holding against her will." The sheriff looked from Holloway's fancy suit to Silas's worn homestead. "Is that true, Brennan?" "She came to me for help, Jim. Ran through a blizzard to escape him. Nearly died doing it. Does that sound like a woman who wants to be with him?" "The woman is unwell," Holloway interrupted. "She has had a mental breakdown." The sheriff ignored him. "Let us ask the lady herself," he said, dismounting his horse. "Seems to me a woman who can run 20 miles in a snowstorm has a pretty sound mind. Silas hesitated for a moment, then called out, "Clara, it is safe. Come on up." The cellar door opened, and Clara emerged, walking straight to the porch with her chin held high. "Miss Whitmore," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, "this man claims you ran off in a state of distress. What do you have to say?" Clara looked directly at Holloway, her eyes burning with a fire he could not quench. "I say he is a liar. My own father sold me to him to pay his gambling debts. For 3 years he held me prisoner. I escaped the night of a wedding I never agreed to, and I would rather die than go back with him." Her voice was strong and clear, and every man there heard the truth in it. The sheriff turned to Holloway, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Seems pretty clear to me. The lady does not want to go with you, and last I checked, we do not force women into marriage in this territory. I believe it is time for you to leave, Mr. Holloway." Holloway's face twisted into an ugly sneer. The mask of civility was gone. "You will regret this," he spat at Silas. "All of you will." Silas stood tall on his porch as Holloway and his men rode away in a cloud of dust. "Maybe," he said quietly to himself, "but I will sleep just fine tonight." Once Holloway's carriage was just a speck on the prairie, Clara's strength finally left her. Silas caught her before she hit the dust. "He's gone," he said gently. "Not for good," she whispered into his chest. "A man like him never truly loses." Silas pulled back to look her square in the eye. "Then whatever he throws at us, we face it together." She stared at him, this impossible man offering her a hope she had long since buried. "Why fight for me?" His voice was gravelly. "Because I never stopped loving you. A man cannot just turn love off like a spigot." Sheriff Cartwright broke the quiet. "Hate to interrupt, but this is not over. Holloway has money and connections. He will make trouble for you." Tom Henley stepped up. "Well, he will have trouble with me, too. A man who treats a woman like property has no place here." Old Pete from the general store agreed, and soon others joined in, promising their support. Not everyone spoke up, but enough did to make a difference. Clara was stunned. These folks, who had every reason to shun her, were standing up for her. A simple "thank you" was all she could manage to say. Doc Wilson just smiled. "Silas is a good man, and that is good enough for us." As the townsfolk left, Sheriff Cartwright gave one last warning. "Watch your back. Holloway will not fight fair." He tipped his hat. "And for heaven's sake, get that woman some shoes." Later, Silas admitted to his boy, Eli, that the bad man would probably be back. That night, Clara found him on the porch, rifle in hand. "He will not come tonight," she said. "So why are you standing guard?" Silas stared into the dark for a long time before answering. "I am thinking about Jed," he finally said. "He lit out yesterday without a word. I reckon he was feeding Holloway information all along." The cold realization hit Clara. "He could have told Holloway I was here the night I arrived." Silas nodded grimly. "Jed Carver always looks out for himself first. I guess he was never my friend. I just refused to see it." She took his hand, and they sat in silence under the vast, starry sky. They were two souls who had been betrayed, now finding their way back to trust together. "The boys asked if you were going to be their new mama," Silas said into the quiet. "What did you say?" Clara asked, her heart skipping a beat. "I told them some things take time." He looked at her then. "Was I wrong?" "No," she whispered. "But I would like to find out what we could be." Silas kissed her hand. "I have been letting you in since I first saw you on that road. I do not know how to stop." But trouble came with the dawn. One of Cartwright's deputies rode in hard. "Sheriff needs you in town. It is Holloway. He filed papers with the judge." Clara stood in the doorway, her face losing all its color. "What kind of papers?" The deputy looked at Clara with something like pity. "Custody papers, ma'am. Mr. Holloway is claiming you are mentally unfit to make your own decisions." Clara felt her knees give out, and she grabbed the door frame to steady herself. "He wants the court to give him guardianship over you," the deputy added. "He cannot do that," she whispered. Silas stepped forward. "The judge is in Holloway's pocket. It does not matter what is true. It only matters what Judge Porter decides." He was already grabbing his coat. "The hearing is this afternoon at 2 o'clock. We will be there." The deputy hesitated. You should know Holloway brought doctors with him, and your father is here testifying against you. A small, broken sound escaped Clara's lips. My father is here in town? Silas put a firm arm around her trembling shoulders. Then we will face him too, he said, together. You do not understand, she said, her eyes wild with fear. My father needs this marriage. Without Holloway's money, my family is ruined. He will say anything to make it happen. Then let him be ruined, Silas said, his voice hard as iron. You are not a piece of property for him to sell. The judge will not see it that way, Clara cried. Everyone knows he is corrupt, with my own father and 3 doctors telling him I am mad. Then we will find our own people, Silas insisted, people who know you are sane. It is not enough. It has to be, Silas said, gripping her shoulders. Look at me, Clara. I did not fight to get you back just to let a crooked judge hand you over. We are going to walk into that courtroom and we are going to fight. Do you hear me? We fight. She looked at this man who had every reason to hate her, but instead stood ready to take on the world for her. Okay, she breathed. We fight. Silas kissed her forehead. That is my girl. Now let us go show that judge what real justice looks like. The wagon ride into town felt like a funeral march. Clara sat beside Silas, wearing a faded dress borrowed from his late wife. She looked like a simple rancher's wife, not a wealthy man's bride. She thought that was good. You are shaking, Silas said gently. I am terrified. That is okay, he replied. Being scared just means you know what is at stake. She looked at this strong, steady man who had already lost so much. Why are you not scared? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. For 3 years, I was scared of all the wrong things. Scared you had forgotten me. Scared I was not good enough. I do not have room for that kind of fear anymore. The only thing I am scared of now is losing you again. Tears burned in Clara's eyes. She took his hand and squeezed it tight. You will not lose me, she promised. No matter what happens today, you will not lose me. The town square was buzzing with people. A runaway bride against a Denver millionaire was the biggest show in town. Sheriff Cartwright met them on the courthouse steps, his face grim. Judge Porter is already inside, so are Holloway and your father. Clara's grip on Silas's arm tightened. Holloway has 3 doctors ready to lie for him, the sheriff warned, and your father is saying you have been unstable since you were a little girl. That is a lie, Clara whispered. It does not matter if it is true, the sheriff said. It only matters if the judge believes it. He then stepped aside, revealing a nervous, middle-aged woman in a plain maid's dress. Before you go in, Cartwright said, you need to talk to Martha Henley. The woman twisted her hands. Ma'am, you would not remember me. I worked in the kitchens at Mr. Holloway's house in Denver. But I remember you. I remember them locking you in your room, and I remember hearing you cry at night. Silas stepped forward. Why are you here? Because it is the right thing to do, Martha said. She pulled a stack of papers from her apron. And because I took these with me when I left. Silas took the letters. His eyes flew across the first page and then grew wide. What is it? Clara asked, her voice trembling. They are letters, he said, his voice rough with anger, between your father and Holloway. They were planning what to do if you tried to run away. He handed her the papers. Holloway suggested putting you in an asylum. Your father agreed. Clara saw the words in her own father's handwriting. They discussed her future as if she were a horse to be traded, agreeing to have her locked away forever if she did not obey. He knew, she whispered in horror. He knew what Holloway planned all along. He helped plan it, Martha said softly. I am sorry, miss. I know he is your father, but some truths have to be told. Clara looked up at the courthouse. The man who had sold her was inside. The man who taught her how to read and walked her to school was waiting to destroy her. Let us go, she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. The courtroom was packed. Judge Porter sat sneering from his bench. Holloway sat in the front row with his doctors, and beside him sat her father, Charles Whitmore. He looked older and smaller, but his eyes were just as cold as she remembered. He refused to look at her. The bailiff called the court to order. Holloway stood and began his performance. Your Honor, I have witnessed Miss Whitmore's troubling behavior for 3 years. She has paranoid delusions and recently ran into a blizzard in nothing but a wedding dress. He then called his doctors. One by one, they took the stand and told terrible lies. They spoke of female hysteria and described episodes of madness that never happened. They even produced a document, a forgery with her signature, requesting treatment. "That is not true," Clara whispered to Silas. "I never signed that." Finally, Holloway called his last witness. "I call Charles Whitmore to the stand." Her father walked to the stand, put his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then, without looking at his own daughter, he began to lie. "Clara was always a difficult child," he said, his voice steady. "She lived in a fantasy world. That is why I arranged her marriage to Mr. Holloway. I hoped a good husband would cure her." "And did it?" Holloway asked. "I am afraid not," her father said, shaking his head with fake sadness. The episodes continued. "No further questions," Holloway said, sitting down with a smug smile. "Miss Whitmore," the judge sneered, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" Clara stood up, her hands trembling, but her voice firm. "I do, Your Honor." She turned to face her father. "Father, do you remember teaching me that the truth will always come out?" Charles Whitmore shifted in his seat. "Clara, this is not the place." "This is the perfect place," she said, her voice ringing through the silent room. "Silas, the letters, please." Silas stood and handed the stack of letters to the bailiff, who gave them to the judge. A wave of confusion swept through the courtroom. Judge Porter began to read, his sneers slowly melting into a look of shock, then panic. The letters detailed the entire conspiracy, from the sale of Clara for debt relief to the plan to lock her away in an asylum. It even mentioned a generous gift to a certain judge to ensure his cooperation. The courtroom erupted. Judge Porter slammed his gavel, his face pale. "This hearing is over. Petition for guardianship is denied." Holloway and Charles Whitmore were surrounded by angry townspeople as they tried to flee. Clara watched them go, feeling nothing but relief. She was finally free. Silas took her hand and led her out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight. "What happens now?" she asked, blinking back happy tears. "Now," he said, pulling her close, "we go home." And for the first time in a very long time, Clara knew exactly where home was. The truth had not only set her free, it had shown her the way back to the only man who had ever truly fought for her. In the courtroom, Clara's own brother, Charles, claimed she was delusional. "We only wanted what was best for her," he said sadly. "You are lying," Clara shouted, unable to stop herself. The judge banged his gavel. "Silence, Miss Whitmore, or you will be removed." Silas gently pulled her down. "Easy now, our turn is coming." The judge turned his sneer on Silas. "You are not a lawyer." "No, sir," Silas replied calmly, "but I know the truth from a lie." "Then call your witness." Silas stood tall. "I call Martha Henley to the stand." For the first time, Holloway's smug confidence wavered, replaced by a flicker of pure shock. Martha's hands shook, but her voice was steady. "My name is Martha Henley. I was a kitchen maid at Mr. Holloway's home for 4 years." She told the court everything she saw, Clara locked in the guest house with guards at the door day and night. "She was not ill," Martha stated plainly. "She was a prisoner. She was sharp as a tack, and the only sadness I ever saw was when she spoke of the man she loved." She looked right at Silas. Holloway jumped to his feet, yelling, "She was fired for theft." "I quit," Martha shot back. "I could not stand by and watch." The judge's voice was like ice. "Sit down, Mr. Holloway. I will decide what is relevant here." Martha said she heard it all through the kitchen wall. She heard Whitmore's gambling debts and Holloway's offer to wipe them clean in exchange for Clara's hand. She heard them laugh, saying the girl had no choice. The courtroom exploded. "That is hearsay," Clara's father yelled. "She is making it up." "No, sir. I got proof," Martha shot back, pointing a finger at Silas. "He has the letters." Every head in the room turned. "Your Honor," Silas said, his voice steady, "I have letters between Marcus Holloway and Charles Whitmore. They detail the plan to sell Clara for her father's debts. They even plotted to put her in an asylum if she refused." He held the papers high. "Forgeries," Holloway snarled. "Their handwriting is all over these," Silas said calmly. "Any expert will tell you so." The judge went pale, his eyes darting between the two men. "There is no illness here, Your Honor," Silas declared. "This is a conspiracy to steal a woman's freedom. The doctors lied, the signature is forged. This whole trial is a sham." The crowd roared its approval. The judge slammed his gavel so hard the wood cracked. "Order!" Once things quieted, Holloway stood. Regardless, he said, his voice tight with rage, the woman fled into a blizzard barefoot. That is not the act of a sane person. That is the act of a desperate woman, Silas answered, one who would rather face death than a cage. Pretty words do not change facts, Mr. Brennan. No, Silas agreed, but new facts do. He turned to the crowd. I called Doc Wilson to the stand. Is she competent, Dr. Wilson? The judge asked. Wilson gave a firm nod. Your Honor, in 20 years, I have not met a clearer mind. That woman is stubborn and sharp, not crazy. She has just been through hell. Holloway started sweating bullets. Judge Porter looked trapped. With so many eyes on him, he could not just do Holloway's bidding. Court will recess for 1 hour, he announced. Clara felt her hope drain away. Silas knelt by her side. You did good, he whispered. Porter is scared. He knows if he rules against you, his career is over. But Holloway will not let it go, she said. Then we will deal with Holloway, Silas replied. That hour felt like a lifetime as folks came by to offer support. Then she saw her father. Charles Whitmore stood there, pale and trembling. I suppose you hate me, he mumbled. I do not know what I feel, Clara answered, her voice empty. For 3 years I tried to understand how you could sell me. He stammered, I was in trouble. Holloway offered a way out. So my life was worth less than your debts? She asked. I thought you would be happy. A fine house. You gave me a prison. She cut him off. A gilded cage, his eyes filled with tears. I am sorry, I know it is not enough. Clara faced him. You are right, she said. It is not enough. Maybe someday I will forgive you, but not today. She turned and walked away, leaving him broken. Back in the courtroom, Judge Porter's hands trembled. I have considered all the evidence, he began. There are serious allegations on both sides. He acknowledged the letters and the coercion, giving Clara a flash of hope. But then her hope died. However, the judge continued, fleeing into a storm does suggest impaired judgment. He slammed the gavel down on his words. I am ordering a 30-day evaluation. Miss Whitmore will be sent to the asylum in Helena. No, Clara cried out, jumping to her feet. That is a death sentence. Just then, the courtroom doors flew open. A man covered in trail dust strode in. Who in the hell are you, Porter demanded. Thomas Reed, Your Honor. I am an assistant to the governor, and I bring orders from him directly. The judge's face turned white as a sheet. Reed approached the bench. The governor has reviewed this case, including the letters. He has issued an executive order. All proceedings against Clara Whitmore are to stop. Furthermore, Marcus Holloway is to be arrested for unlawful imprisonment. Holloway jumped up, shouting, This is outrageous! Reed's voice was like ice. The governor has also ordered an investigation into Judge Porter's finances. The judge's gavel fell from his hand. Sheriff Cartwright stepped forward. Marcus Holloway, you are under arrest. As deputies dragged him away, Holloway leaned toward Clara. This is not over, he hissed. Silas stepped between them. Get him out of here. Then silence. Clara stood there, stunned. She was free, truly free. Her knees buckled and Silas caught her. 3 years of pain poured out in racking shums. It is over, he murmured, holding her tight. You are free. She looked up, her face wet with tears. What now? Silas gave her the first real smile she had seen from him. Now, he said, we go home. On the wagon ride home, the heavy weight she had carried for 3 years was just gone. She breathed in the crisp, clean air. You are quiet, Silas said gently. This morning I was headed for an asylum, she replied. Now, I do not even know what I am. You are free, he said. That is what you are. As the town disappeared behind them, she finally asked the question that scared her most. The boys, do you think they could ever see me as... She could not say the word. Silas stopped the wagon. Clara, my boys have been praying for a mother. Sam draws pictures of a family with a mama in it. Her eyes welled up. But that does not mean they want me. Sam told you he liked your hair, Silas reminded her. He barely talks to anyone. Children know things, Clara. They saw something good in you. That ain't nothing. She looked at their joined hands. I do not know how to be a mother, she confessed. Nobody does until they are one, he said kindly. You just figure it out. And if you get it wrong, you apologize and try again. He squeezed her hand. As the ranch came into view, with smoke curling from the chimney, it looked like a promise of home. The moment the wagon stopped, the cabin door flew open. "Papa!" young Sam cried, running out with his boots on the wrong feet. "Did you win? Is the bad man gone?" Silas swung down and swept the boy into his arms. "We won, son. He is going to jail for a long, long time." Eli, the older brother, stood in the doorway, more serious. He looked right at Clara. "You are staying," he stated, like it was already decided. As Clara climbed down, Eli walked right up to her. "You make Papa smile," he said bluntly. "He does not smile much, but he does with you around." He stuck out a small hand. "Welcome to our family, Miss Clara." She shook his hand, then pulled the boy into a hug. After a moment, his little arms squeezed her tight. "I am glad you did not die in the snow," he mumbled into her shoulder. "Me too, Eli," she whispered. "Me too." Sam squirmed free and dove into the hug. "Me too," he chirped. For the first time in years, a real laugh escaped Clara's lips as she held the two boys. She looked up and saw Silas watching, his eyes full of emotion. "This," he said in a rough voice, "this is what I always imagined." That night, after the boys were asleep, they sat together on the porch under a sky full of stars. "Can I ask about Sarah, your wife?" Clara asked quietly. Silas was silent for a long moment. "She was a good, kind woman," he finally said. "She deserved better than me. I was broken after I lost you, and she spent her life trying to fix a man who could not be fixed." Clara felt a familiar pang of guilt. "I am so sorry, Silas." "Do not be," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "None of this was your fault. Your father, Holloway, they made their choices. You just survived. We cannot get the past back, Clara, but we can choose what comes next." "And what is next?" she asked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring that shined in the starlight. "This was my grandmother's. I was going to give it to you 3 years ago." He looked into her eyes. "I am not asking you to marry me right now. I know we need time, but I want you to have this. Think of it as a promise," he said, "that I am in this for good. I lost you once because I did not fight hard enough. I will not make that mistake again." Clara looked from the ring to his face, and a single word escaped her lips. "Yes." "Yes, what?" he asked, a smile touching his face. "Yes, I will wear it. Yes, I will stay. Yes to you, Silas Brennan." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it was made for her. "You are a foolish man," she laughed through her tears. "Probably," he said, "but I am your foolish man now." He kissed her then, and it was not like the stolen kisses of their youth. This was a new beginning. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Clara," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I need to tell you something." "What did he say, Silas?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Holloway. I heard him yelling before they took him." Silas's jaw was a hard line. "He made threats, but it is more than that. Cartwright says Holloway has friends in high places, the kind of men who can make jail bars disappear." The cold fear returned to her bones. "So this is not over." "I aim to see it is," Silas said, his voice a low, steady promise. "He will never touch you again. I would die before I let that happen. Do you understand me?" 3 weeks went by. The rhythms of the ranch became a healing balm for Clara's soul. The honest work, the early mornings, the quiet evenings. She learned that Eli liked his eggs runny and that Sam could not sleep without his mother's old blanket. She was learning how to be part of a family again. One morning, a rider appeared on the ridge. It was Sheriff Cartwright, his face set like stone. Clara grabbed the rifle by the door. "Sheriff," she called from the porch, "is something wrong?" "Is Silas here?" he asked, swinging down from his horse. "I need to talk to both of you." When Silas came out from the barn, his eyes went from Clara to the sheriff's grim face. "Jim, what is it?" Cartwright took off his hat. "Holloway is dead. Found him in his cell this morning. They are saying he hanged himself with his belt." Silas stood completely still. "Are you certain it was suicide?" "That is the official story." "Que the sheriff said, "but a man like that, already calling in favors? It does not feel right. I think his powerful friends decided he had become a problem they needed to solve." Clara felt the world spin and sat down hard on the porch step. "So he is really gone?" "He is gone," Cartwright confirmed. "But that is not all. His lawyers are going through his papers. Turns out he had no will and no family. He pulled a folded document from inside his coat. This is a marriage contract between Holloway and your father. It has a dowry clause. Clara frowned. I do not understand. It says that if the marriage did not happen for any reason other than your death, a dowry of $50,000 was to be paid to the bride. To you. Silence fell. $50,000. The number was too big to even imagine. That cannot be right, Clara whispered, her fingers numb. It is ironclad, Cartwright said gently. Holloway was so arrogant, so sure you would never escape, that he never worried about it. Miss Whitmore, you are now a very wealthy woman. After the sheriff rode away, Clara stared at the contract on the kitchen table. I do not want it, she said, her voice shaking. It is blood money. It was meant to purchase me like I was livestock. Silas watched her for a long moment. Then what if you change what the money means? He asked softly. What if you use it for something good? Clara looked up, confused. Like what? That asylum, he said, his voice gaining strength. The horrible place they threatened to send you to. You said people go in and never come out. It is a nightmare, she agreed. Then use his money to build a better place. A real hospital that actually heals people. You can turn his evil into something good, Clara. She stared at him, then at the paper that was meant to be her chain. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. Spring came to Montana, washing the land clean. The snow melted, the creeks ran high, and birds filled the air with song. From the porch, Clara watched Eli patiently teaching Sam how to handle a rope. The builder started on the new hospital yesterday, she told Silas as he came to stand beside her. Dr. Wilson is helping with the plans. He thinks we can start taking patients by the fall. That is fast, Silas said, putting his arm around her. I see your father wrote you another letter. Clara stiffened. I know. They just keep coming. Apologies and promises. I do not know if I can ever forgive him. He is the only family I have left, she murmured. That is not true, Silas said, his voice firm. You have got the boys, and you have got me. Blood is not what protected you, Clara. Blood is what sold you. This family, our family, we chose each other. That means more than anything. She leaned into his warmth, feeling a peace she never thought possible. I love you, she said. Papa, I did it, Sam yelled, running toward them with the rope. I lassoed the fence post. Eli followed at a walk, a proud grin on his face. You are getting better, he admitted. Clara knelt and met Sam's bright, excited eyes. You are getting much better, she said. Soon you will be teaching us all. And in that moment, surrounded by her boys, Clara knew she was finally home. One sunny afternoon, little Sam grew serious. Miss Clara, he asked, can I call you something different? Like what, sweet boy? She asked, her heart tightening. Like Ma? The word was a tiny, hopeful whisper. Eli says I should not, 'cause you are not our real Ma, but you feel like one. Seeing the tears shining in Silas's eyes, Clara knelt down. Sam, I would be honored if you called me Ma. Really? He gasped, and then threw his arms around her neck. I love you, Ma. Those words healed a part of her she thought had died forever. I love you too, sweetheart. She opened an arm toward Eli, who stood watching. There is room for you too. The boy hesitated for only a second before he walked into the embrace, completing their circle. A family found. They were a messy, patched-together family, but they were real. That evening, neighbors filled the cabin, their laughter and music pushing out old shadows. Word had spread about what happened to Holloway and how Clara was using her inheritance to build a town hospital. Silas pulled her away from the happy noise. He pressed a folded paper into her hand. It was a marriage license, already signed by the new judge. Silas took her hands in his. I know I said we could wait, Clara, but I have already lost 3 years. I am not about to lose another single day. Clara stared at the paper, then at the man she loved. Silas Brennan, she whispered, are you asking me to marry you right now? He dropped to one knee right there in the middle of his bustling kitchen. I am asking you to be my wife tonight, tomorrow, and every day after. I loved you when we were young. I loved you through the lost years, and I love you now. Will you marry me? The room fell silent. With tears of joy streaming down her face, Clara said, Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married that night in the very cabin where he had saved her life. It turned out Doc Wilson was also a licensed minister, and the boys, Sam and Eli, stood proudly beside them as witnesses. It was not the big church wedding she had imagined as a girl with a silk dress and hundreds of guests. It was so much better. It was real. Later, after the guests were gone and the boys were asleep, they stood together on the porch. "Mrs. Brennan," Silas said, testing the name. "Mr. Brennan," she replied with a smile. "How does it feel?" Clara thought of all she had survived, from the kidnapping to the courtroom. Then she thought of all she had found. "It feels like home," she said. "It feels like I finally found my way home." Silas pulled her close. "You will never have to run again. You will never have to be afraid or alone." Out on the Montana plains, two people who had been broken by the world had managed to make each other whole. The best stories do not always end with grand battles. Sometimes they end quietly, with a man and woman holding each other in the dark, ready for whatever comes next. They end with two boys sleeping soundly, dreaming of the mother they finally have. They end with a patient, stubborn love that proves even the harshest winter must finally give way to spring. Clara Whitmore had walked barefoot through a blizzard, but she was finally home.